Hello, and welcome to the North Carolina Museum of History and the 20th African American Cultural Celebration. I'm Bridget Lacey, and I'm the host for the Health, Wellness, and Food area of the festival. Our presentation will begin in just a moment, but first we have a few program notes. We will have time for a Q&A at the end of the presentation. Please send us your questions using the chat function, and we'll do our best to share them with the presenter. We have many additional resources about African American history in North Carolina on our website at nc-aacc.com. Become a member of the Museum of History Associates at this event and get your membership for half price. Sponsors of the NC Museum of History Foundation for helping to make this event possible. The project is funded in part by the City of Raleigh based on recommendations from the Raleigh Arts Commission. Now, let's get started. I am so happy to be here with Dr. Sorry. We have some more sponsors we want to show for a second. Okay, now let's get started. I want to introduce our let's get started. I want to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Tonya Armstrong. The name of her topic is Black Women's Guide to Self-Care During COVID-19. By age 12, the Durham native knew what she wanted to pursue, child psychology and music, and proceeded to double major in both at Yale University. As a person of deep faith, she realized that spirituality is a vital component of many lives. After completing her doctorate in child clinical psychology at UNC Chapel Hill, she earned a Master of Theological Studies degree at Duke Divinity School. In addition to embracing her role as Minister of Congregation Care and Counseling at Union Baptist Church in Durham, she taught courses in pastoral care at Duke Divinity School. She established the Armstrong Center for Hope in August 2010. Clinically, she works primarily with children, adolescents, couples, and families on issues of depression, anxiety, ADD, ADHD, grief and loss, and relationship challenges. In 2012, she was recognized in June as one of the Female Entrepreneurs of the Year by the Durham section of the National Council of Negro Women. Since July of 2013, she has served the Apex School of Theology as the Dean of the Master of Arts in Christian Counseling program. She is also the president-elect of the North Carolina Association of Psychological Association. In addition, she released her debut gospel album, Choose Hope, in 2009, and she is the author of the book Blossoming Hope, the Black Christian Woman's Guide to Mental Health and Wellness. She credits her family, including nuclear, extended, and church, as a significant foundation for her success. I hand you over to Dr. Tonya Armstrong.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to be here with you today, here in cyberspace as we celebrate this 20th anniversary of the African American Cultural Celebration sponsored by the North Carolina Museum of History. So today I'm going to be talking about the Black Woman's Guide to Self-Care during COVID-19. And I'd like to show you on this next slide that often when we think about health and wellness, we have tended to think in sort of either or boxes. Either we're ill or we're well. But as you can see from this image, wellness and illness actually fall together on a spectrum. And if you look for a moment toward the left side of the image, you can see that as you progress from the middle toward the left, that you'll first observe signs perhaps of an illness. And we can think about this perhaps most simply in terms of the common cold. So you have signs, you may have a fever or may have a cough, you progress to symptoms, and then you have the full-fledged cold. And while we're not too concerned about the common cold, there are many other types of illnesses that if they're left untreated can end up in us having not only disability, but premature death. And so a lot of times we feel if we haven't gone through signs and symptoms and disability, that we are well. If you look at the image, however, you can see that the middle point is only neutral. It does not imply that we have wellness, only the absence of illness. And so my role at the Armstrong Center and at Union Baptist Church and other places where I serve is to make people aware of how important it is to understand and educate ourselves in issues of wellness so that we can grow and we can move toward the right side of the image, high levels of wellness. And so we'll be talking about how self-care can be a tool toward wellness. If you look at the next slide, you can see that there are some definitions to self-care that I'd like to highlight. Self-care sometimes can be best understood in terms of what it is as well as what it is not. So to the left, you can see that self-care is self-initiated care for yourself that often happens across multiple spheres of functioning. So if someone else decides to treat you in a very special way, then that's wonderful, but self-care is actually self-initiated. It is also intentional. We usually just don't accidentally slip into good self-care. We have to be deliberate about its pursuit. And self-care is replenishing. When we've engaged in good self-care, we feel replenished. We feel like we can come back to the tasks and the demands that may be upon us. And as Black women, it is very often that there are many demands placed upon us. Zora Neale Hurston actually stated that the Black woman is the mule of the world. And the case is that often there are expectations from so many different people, so many different agencies, organizations, workplaces in our lives. And so we especially have to be intentional about self-care. I also want to mention that self-care is a mindset. So when we've been intentional about pursuing it, we find ourselves thinking more and more and practicing behaviors that reflect the mindset and not just a temporary thought about self-care. So let's talk about what self-care is not. Self-care is not arbitrary. It's not discrete. It's not this one time, oh yeah, back in August, I think I had a moment of self-care. Hopefully, we are people who are learning more and more how to make it very intentional. And here's the number one thing that I hear from a lot of my clients who happen to be mostly Black women, but I'll hear, oh, well, I don't really know if I should do that. I would feel so selfish. And we've often been given messages across our culture that taking care of ourselves is selfish. But if you've ever tried to pour from an empty cup, you realize that that is futile and that we do absolutely have to be replenished so that we can continue to support others. So self-care is not this extreme form of only thinking of ourselves, but making sure that we're thinking of and taking care of ourselves so that we can give back to our communities. I also want to just mention that self-care is self-initiated, but not always something that you completely execute by yourself. It really takes the community, even for self-care. So one of my favorite examples is the fact that I love massage. And so COVID-19 has been pretty difficult for me because it's been a little scary to think about going into places for massage. However, if I'm going to pursue that level of self-care, I've got several people that I need to rely on, making sure that my children are tended to, and making sure that my business is taken care of while I'm away, and making sure that the person who is practicing good massage is someone who is really good at it. So it takes the community even for us to be involved in self-care. So sometimes I do like to call it communitarian care. And then self-care is not just about us having this conversation today. It's about actions. It's about what can we do to actually execute self-care. So I've got lots of ideas for you about that. As we look toward our next slide, you can see that there are common barriers to self-care. They can be things that are good in and of themselves, but we have to look at where's the balance in our lives. So work could be a barrier. If we're saying, okay, I actually work from home now, but now I'm working longer hours. We have to question that and establish some boundaries. Or, I really enjoy spending time with my partner, but if I'm catering to my partner's needs too much, then I may not have balance for myself, where my children may have lots of demands. I have other family members, extended family members who may have needs. And of course, we're interested in being able to meet those needs, but we want to make sure there is balance. Perhaps some of our work and our engagement with clubs and organizations has been somewhat restrained by COVID. Maybe not. Maybe you're as busy as ever. But all of those great sororities and fraternities and civic associations and our faith communities, they're all good in and of themselves, but we have to be keeping them in balance. And then social media is something that people are spending more and more time on. You've probably noticed that just in the last week or two, you've seen all kinds of new hashtags on Facebook about some pictures that you should send, now and then, or maybe it's, your child or your spouse that you send pictures of, your mother. And so those are fun things. But if we're doing those instead of self-care, we may want to watch out. We also know that the reality is that being quarantined has its own set of risks. And sometimes those risks are in the forms of addiction. Sometimes they seem like they are the kinds of things that started out innocently enough, but with our exposure to the internet and to retail therapy and to maybe the use of the kinds of substances that, as we get more and more removed from society, could be a risk to us. So we want to be careful about that. And then one of the biggest objections that I hear from my clients about self-care, in addition to feeling that it is selfish, is not always being convinced that we deserve self-care, that we really should have it. Maybe someone else has indicated that everybody else always comes first. And so then we kind of question if we are worth self-care. And I just want to emphasize to all of the listeners today that indeed we are worth good self-care. So let's look at how we can pursue that. On our next slide, we can see that when we celebrate the fullness of who we are, which is what I've written about in Blossoming Hope, the Black Christian Woman's Guide to Mental Health and Wellness, the book addresses the different areas where we can practice self-care. So it includes the mind, the body, the spirit, and the soul. And so let's take a look at each of those areas. On our next slide, we can see that when we're taking good care of our minds, we're paying more attention to our thoughts. We're paying attention to how much of what we're thinking day to day is positive and how much of it may be negative. And some of those negative thoughts we didn't necessarily come up with on our own. Maybe they were messages that we heard from others in our lives, but maybe we internalized them, we took them in, and so now we keep repeating them in our minds. And so we have to actually be intentional about eliminating the negative thoughts as we increase the positive ones. It's also important to recognize that stress is a part of human life. And so it's not necessarily our goal to eliminate stress, but we do have to keep things that are stressors into perspective. And then it comes to a point where we have to recognize the importance of our minds in practicing mindfulness, that is being present in the moment, right now, not 5 minutes from now or 2 days from now, certainly not back 5 years ago, but just being present in the moment. What do you hear? What do you see? What do you taste? Just being aware of those parts of our being are so important for mindful self-care. Now, on our next slide, you can also see that self-care of the body is very important. And if you're anything like my clients, like my family, and yes, like me, you have probably noticed that COVID has given the opportunity for us to be exposed to what some people call the Rona 15. You know, we've been around the house, we've got access to our cupboards and our refrigerators like never before. And it's been more easy to eat more or eat more of the things that aren't so healthy for us, maybe move less. We're sitting on Zoom calls all day or constricted to our homes more often than we used to be. So we're not necessarily eating and being fit the way that we want to, but January is such a great time to just press the reset button and to say, let's start over and let's find some new habits, even the small habits that can help us get right again. It's also really important for us to focus on sleep. I hear a lot of people talking about sleeping much longer. And while it is important for us to get a full night's sleep, we want to be careful if we're getting much, much more sleep than before, or having a really hard time getting asleep and staying asleep as long as we want to in the morning, or as long as we need to, I should say. So we want to be careful about our sleep. That's a part of our self-care, is finding that good balance of sleep and being aware of our bodies. What are our bodies saying to us? Certainly, COVID has restrained our activities, and sometimes our bodies are responding, sometimes we're too sedentary. So we should listen to what our bodies are saying. That's the self-caring thing to do. On our next slide, I wanted to talk about self-care of the soul. So the soul is that place, sometimes you think of it as your heart, where those things that are most precious to you reside. Things like your hopes, your dreams, your feelings, how you're really feeling. And you know, in our culture, we don't always put a lot of weight on feelings, or maybe we've been discouraged from feeling anything at all. You just do. That's just how it is. You just do it. But every now and then, we have to take a moment for our feelings. We have to recognize that in this space, maybe we've spent more time in our homes than ever before, that the beauty around us is important. It's something that we want to spend more time on because it influences how we perceive ourselves in our day. And then we've got these relationships that have shifted perhaps during COVID. Some of them have become closer just by proximity, and some of them have become strained. Some of them because we don't see our family or friends the way that we used to. Our friendships and our relationships are altered. So I encourage you to think about how those relationships that are fulfilling and positive are ones that you want to continue to nurture during COVID. And then the book also talks about self-care of the soul in terms of both time and money. Those are two commodities that are limited. And because we can recognize that they are limited, we have to be strategic in how we interact with them. How do you want your time to be different in 2021? How do you want your money to be different? These are questions to ask ourselves rather than sort of kicking the can until next year. So if you look at the next slide, you can see that the self-care of the spirit is a really important part of how we maintain hope and joy and peace, especially during the coronavirus. And so some of the things that I've listed on the PowerPoint are things that are sort of the traditional ways that many faith traditions have talked about us maintaining spiritual connection. So the importance of prayer and sort of recognizing that that is a bidirectional process. We speak, but we also listen. Sacred readings can give us faith because as unprecedented as COVID-19 is, there are things that are much older and more ancient, the wisdom that we can pull from to help us through these difficult times. And then there's some things that you won't find, for example, back home in my Bible, I'm not going to find references to Tai Chi or Qigong. But it's important to recognize that those systems and forms of movement are a really important part, not just physically, but also in terms of our spiritual connection, feeling that we are ultimately connected to the Most High. It's important for us to commune with nature. And I have found that to be really a lifesaver during COVID for myself, just getting outside a lot more. The joy of journaling is something we should not forget during this time. And even behind our own closed doors, if you will, we can still provide community service checking in on people and making sure that they're doing all right, even in their basic needs. And also remember that we are ultimately artistic people. We have ways of expressing ourselves in new ways, finding new hobbies, new ways to open up our spirits to the beauty of creation. So in our next slide, you can see that there are these different ways that we've talked about self-care in different areas, but I want to emphasize some operating principles that govern all of those areas. For one thing, it's important to acknowledge your finite humanity. All of the things that we've talked about today, you will not be able to start at the same time. There's actually an inventory inside of Blossoming Hope that helps you to score yourself and see where you rank in each of those self-care areas. And sometimes those areas that are maybe needing a little bit more enhancement are a good place to start. But because we've only got this one life to live and we don't know how long it's going to be, we don't want to postpone self-care. We also don't want to postpone joy. Continue to connect with your sources of joy. And you'll find that even in a time of absurdity, when we look at the things that have occurred around us, that there is still this place of joy that we can attain. We don't have to wait for the economy to get back on its feet. We don't have to wait for everyone to be vaccinated. We can find joy now. Practice saying no. No is its own sentence. It does not require explanation. And often you have to say no to some things in order to say yes to the self-care activities that your body is craving. And then accept and ask for help. There is this notion, Black women, of this strong Black woman disorder that has been written about, where we sometimes think that we are superwomen, that we are invincible, that we don't need help and support because we've got it. And the reality is that, again, we are human. We can be vulnerable at times. We can be very strong at times, and I'm grateful for that. It's a part of our legacy. But we also need to acknowledge those places of vulnerability so that we can receive help, that replenishment that helps us to grow better and stronger. So on the next slide, I'd like to just note that sometimes when we are trying to move toward wellness, we have impediments that may be the result of actual mental health challenges that we're having. There's no shame to those challenges. And if you happen to be there or a loved one is there, I've listed for you several mental health resources that could be available for finding a therapist, for being able to find immediate help. Some people like to be face-to-face. Some people, most practices are doing telehealth right now. But maybe you want to simply start with an anonymous phone call, or maybe you just need to text a crisis counselor. And so I've listed some of those options there. You can crisis text 741-741 to home and immediately connect to a crisis counselor. And then finally, certainly if you've had thoughts about harming yourself, I certainly want to make you aware of the National Suicide Prevention Hotline and being able to reach them at 1-800-273-TALK. So as we prepare to close and move to our question and answer period, I do want to make you aware of the fact that the Armstrong Center for Hope is available. We are accepting new clients. We're primarily doing therapy via telehealth, but we are doing testing for children face-to-face. And this is just a small part of our team here, but we have offices in Durham as well as Raleigh. And I've offered you our contact information there. And I encourage you to visit our website at armstrongcfh.com to learn more about our providers and our staff. And then for the next slide, I just wanted to make you aware of the Blossoming Hope book and audio experience. Blossoming Hope is available on Amazon and Kindle. There's an audio book that is also available at Apple Music and Google Play. And I'm very excited to share with you that we are going to have a Blossoming Hope virtual pajama party, yes, on February 20th from 7 to 10 p.m. And you can register on Eventbrite, and that link is actually blossominghopepjparty.eventbrite.com. So at this point, I'm going to turn things back over to Ms. Bridget Lacey, and she's going to engage in some question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Tonya. I felt better just listening to that. I felt relaxed. Women are generally seen as nurturers. Why is it so hard for us to prioritize ourselves?
Well, there are many messages that help us or have encouraged us in the past to maybe question our right to self-care. Some of those have been as a result of our race, that we've often felt that we're second-class citizens. And so do we really deserve that? Are we really worthy? Are we still mentally going in the back door of several of our experiences, right? So that's a part of it. Part of it is also a part of our gender. This idea that women are not as good as, not able to take advantage of the full opportunities in society. And, for us to have reached 2021 before we even had our first female vice president tells us something about that. So I think that those kinds of messages, I think our churches sometimes, unfortunately, reinforce those messages as well. If we're not careful, we can send messages from the pulpit. So just want to make sure that we understand. And there are messages in scripture that speak to the importance of women taking care of themselves. But sometimes we get those messages a little mixed up.
Also, you know what? It's funny. One of the things I've done since the pandemic is order new pajamas. Talk a little bit about your pajama party, because there's something about pajamas that feel a little luxurious sometimes.
Yes.
Can you talk about your pajama party?
Yes. I would love to have this experience with women out there, because pajamas are an indication that we're getting cozy, that we're relaxing, that we'll be drifting off a little bit. So I don't want anybody to drift off during the actual celebration, but it's the idea that there's some girl talk that we need to have. There's some real 100% kinds of conversations that we need to have. And so the PJ party will allow us to sort of have some of these conversations in authenticity and with laughter and tears and progress.
Nice.
Yes.
Sounds really good. Let's see. Are there any questions out there?
Can you share your center in Birmingham website for that? Absolutely. The Armstrong Center for Hope, you can Google it, but our website is Armstrong, C as in center, F as in 4, H as in hope.com. And just Googling the Armstrong Center for Hope will bring up our website. And again, we do have locations. We have offices in Durham and Raleigh, but for the therapy, we are working via telehealth, and we would be glad to receive your referrals. There's even a way on the website for you to request an appointment directly on the website, but we also have persons in the office who are answering calls and responding to emails.
And can you talk about what do you do when you have a particularly stressful day? How do you kind of break that up for that self-care, even though you feel like you don't have any more energy left?
One of my favorite things to do is to grab a cup of tea. Recently, my family has gotten really deeply into tea, so we've got some wonderful options at the house. I find some tea. I put my phone down for a little bit because I've always got more stuff coming in, email and messages and more demands. So I put my phone down. I usually find some Netflix. I also have been doing much more reading during the pandemic. So sometimes just getting my mind off of whatever is going on can really help me relax. But I look forward to getting back on the massage table also.
Nice.
Yes.
I like tea too, because I think even taking the time to put water in a kettle and wait for it to boil, all of that is kind of, I think, a part of slowing it down.
That's right.
You know, I never use microwave or any kind of fast method. It's taking that time, letting the tea become tea, letting the tea bag soak in that water. You know, I think all of that is a part of it.
That's right. In my family, we just burnt through a tea kettle, so that gives you a sense of just how much we're doing using tea.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you'll join us for our 3:30 presentation on foods that boost the immune system. And there are many other events to join and watch, including Hungry for Success, how an ex-worker turned entrepreneur opened 2 pizza shops with entrepreneur Ephraim Yates. Just go to the schedule at NCMOH.com and look for the videos on demand area, where you will find these presentations and many other engaging videos on Apple. And Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.